Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today at Reporting on Methane, a panel discussion at the Methane Moment Pavilion here at COP26. I am Troy Shaheen, the US Comms Director at Clean Air Task Force, and I'm going to be facilitating a discussion with Valerie Volcovici of Reuters and Joe Lowe of Climate Home News. We'll be talking about reporting on methane and their experience digging into the topic, kind of how they got started on it, where they see it going. And, methane, of course, has had a big COP. It's, we've seen more than 100 leaders join the Methane Pledge, the Global Methane Pledge, with heads of state lining up to showcase their ambition and, in some cases, their action to cut methane. We've heard again and again that this COP that methane is a powerful super pollutant. More than 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide from a climate warming perspective during its first 20 years in the atmosphere. Primarily emitted from oil and gas, agriculture, and landfills, it's responsible for about half of the global warming we are currently experiencing. The flip side is, of course, that we have a tremendous opportunity to reduce methane emissions quickly, which would have significant climate, public health, and economic benefits. Both of these reporters have followed the issue closely on the global level and in the domestic and regional policy arena. We'll try to facilitate a dialogue around their experience, what it's like to report on methane, and what they're interested in digging into next. So let's start first with you, Valerie. You've been tracking methane for some time now. You've been on the beat, since it was a relatively unknown issue.
Yeah.
And I'd like to just kind of go back to when you first started and talk a little bit about how you first became interested in methane, and what it was like in your newsroom. Was it a particularly known entity, and sort of when that was and how you got started?
Yeah, probably my earliest experience covering methane was more than 10 years ago, covering the emerging carbon markets, voluntary carbon markets, and capturing landfill gas. Capturing methane landfill gas was a voluntary offset. It just seemed like a very obscure thing, something that people who were following the voluntary carbon markets would follow. Eventually, in the U.S., the EPA had some voluntary programs on regulating methane, and I guess it was finally in the Obama administration that we started to see a real push for regulating methane. I don't think there was quite that widespread availability of technology yet that allowed people to see what exactly methane emissions were and how, when you actually see it, I think it really surprises people. I think there was initially amongst environmental groups a lot of disappointment in those Obama regulations because they only targeted the new sources of methane, and there was some kind of voluntary program. But there was some progress in Congress. Congress did. Then I forgot about the Trump. Then under the Trump administration, obviously, there was a rollback of methane regulations. But what was interesting was, I think the oil and gas industry continued to talk about methane, their work on capturing methane, at least on a voluntary basis. It kind of stayed on the radar, and then Congress eventually passed the CRA, so rolled back the Trump rollback, and here we are now. There's a whole pavilion here dedicated to methane and a global pledge, and the U.S. really kind of. I think that for the U.S. it's a real showpiece for the administration because there's potentially huge amounts of emissions cuts, and it's showing that the administration is kind of cracking down on the oil and gas sector. So. It's come a long way since my early exposure to it.
Yeah. And Joe, same question for you. How did you sort of get tipped off about methane, and when did you become interested in it?
Yeah, well, I'm a lot more new to it than Valerie. I think you've been doing it before it was cool. I've kind of got into it since it's become cool. Like, I think the first time I heard it got on my radar was I think it was last April. It was I think it was Biden's leaders summit, and Vladimir Putin had a big section of his speech about how he needs to reduce methane, and that was such a kind of surprising statement for me that kind of caught me onto it. And then the other kind of moment was when one of your colleagues, James Torito, he came to England and he rented out a camper van, and he goes around with this big camera, which I think it's a very expensive camera, and it can see methane emissions, and he uses it to visualize that and to explain it to companies that this is happening, and maybe they take action in it, maybe they don't, but it's a good story either way, and it's good to put a picture to something that could be quite hard to visualize.
Sure, yeah, and I was going to ask that, so for those who don't know, methane is invisible to the naked eye, and relatively recently there have been technologies developed that are still quite expensive, but that are available to see them. So Clean Air Task Force has been documenting them with what's called OGI, optical gas imaging cameras. Other groups are as well. These sort of crew of methane hunters. We're primarily focusing in Europe now, and have worked with Joe on that. And I guess I'm wondering, how does that invisibility of methane factor into the way that you report on it? Is it something that you really, that really helps put a picture to it, or do you really, how does that technology contribute to your ability to report on it? And when we're talking about satellites and things like that in the future, how do you see that enhancing it?
Yeah, I mean, on this trip that I went on with James Torito, he was, he's got the camera which shows the picture, and you can show that to someone and say, look, that's coming out of there, quite obviously. Mm-hmm. Whereas the other thing he had was a kind of measuring stick which measured the methane emissions, and he showed that to the security, and they were like, oh, well, we're on a marsh, so it could be the marsh. And, I don't think that they were right, but it's harder to prove when you don't have the exact image. You just got a kind of a level, a number on a screen,
Yeah.
And obviously for a story, it's huge to have a picture that is kind of half the story. And, if it's in a newspaper, it's half the column inches. So it's massive to be able to visualize it like that.
Yeah. And Valerie, on your end, you do a lot of primarily political and policy and regulatory reporting on this. How do you make methane engaging to an audience without that sort of footage when you're reporting on kind of political goings on?
Yeah, well, I mean, the recent IPCC report that came out over the summer or the fall, really put an emphasis on methane for the first time, and I think the message was pretty clear coming out of that report that quick reductions on methane will go a long way towards reducing overall greenhouse gas emissions, and I think that was a very potent kind of takeaway from that IPCC report that I think policymakers began to use in almost every speech. Obviously, in the U.S., it's any regulation targeting CO2 is challenged. The Clean Power Plan is tied up in legal action, and now the Supreme Court is even going to weigh whether federal agencies can regulate carbon from power plants. So now, and now you also have oil and gas companies saying they support methane legislation. So you have this kind of you've got this political kind of focus on it because of the potential for large cuts at a time when other cuts may be more challenging. And at least you have the word of oil and gas companies that say that they're committed to cracking down on methane, and that some of them say that they've made huge strides. And so in theory you have the private sector and the government kind of walking in the same direction, and the extent to which we'll see this play out in the coming months as the EPA kind of goes more into their rulemaking process, and we start to hear from both environmental groups and the industry, and see where the pushback will be. So in that sense, it's new, and it's a new frontier. Because otherwise, a lot of the other things are tied up in courts, and it's a legal story. So
yeah, and how do you keep all of this straight? There's this Global Methane Pledge here on the global level, and then there's in the courts, there's the legislation, there's industry action, there's advocacy voices. How does the domestic story kind of interplay for you with the the global story here at COP?
Well, as we began to hear mutterings about the emergence of this global methane pledge and the build-up to Paris, I mean, we're always in the months leading up. Sorry, not to Glasgow. In the months leading up to Glasgow, we're looking for all kinds of signs about what the U.S. is going to bring to the table after a four-year hiatus under the Trump administration. As we began to hear about the Global Methane Pledge, we knew that EPA regulations were about to come out, and then they seemed to, it all seemed to come together. I guess it was just like a couple of weeks ago when the administration rolled out both the Global Methane Pledge and the domestic regulations as a package. So it's beginning to make sense, because now I think the administration and other voluntary measures, and I think the pipeline regulator also going forward with some regulations. So the pieces have come together from all of the things that we've been kind of anticipating over the last few months.
Yeah, interesting. So as it's it's converging as it's rising.
Yeah.
It's interesting. In Europe, is it also kind of converging in similar ways? How are you seeing this play out in the EU and in the UK also?
Yeah, I mean, I understand the EU was kind of a driving force behind the methane pledge as well. But I just wonder, how they signed up a load of countries. I wonder how committed they are in practice to what might be necessary. I understand maybe a few of them signed up quite last minute or even after the kind of launch. So have they really thought it through? Do they have the plans? Are those plans going to meet resistance? Is that resistance going to be overcome? I think that they're the kind of interesting issues to look for next.
Yeah, those will all be the questions you'll be asking, I assume. Yeah. I understand in Europe there's also the question of imports. Do you have is that something you're looking into as well?
Yeah, it's one of a few things.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, most of our gas, a lot of it comes from Russia, and I think that's why Putin made the big deal of wanting to clean up, and it's also why I think Gazprom sponsors the UEFA Champions League to try and have a good kind of image in Europe. So yeah. Europe has a big role to play in Russian gas, and it'll be interesting to see how it uses that power.
Yeah, interesting. And going outside of the US and EU, do you see another frontier for reporting on methane as this global methane pledge becomes, truly global? Are there stories or different threads you're interested in that go beyond the US and EU who have kind of led this pledge?
Just that.
Sorry.
Okay.
Either one.
I think just more broadly speaking, I think. What becomes clear as the technology becomes better is that all countries are severely underestimating their methane emissions, and that's a huge area for reporting, because understanding the gap between what's reported and what is actually the methane that's being emitted by different companies, by different operations. I mean, that's a rich area of reporting, and in order to really get a picture of how countries are meeting their overall climate goals, you need to have a better understanding of that gap between their stated emissions and what's actually seen in the on the cameras and through the satellites.
Yeah. And
I was just going to say, I think Nigeria is a really interesting place. The oil and gas, a lot of it's in the developed world, but that there's been a huge issue there for decades with gas flaring and the health impacts that brings, and also the sheer injustice of people going without gas to cook with and having all this gas burnt in front of their face and poisoning them. So that's another area that's very important.
Yeah, interesting. And so we've heard a little bit about these satellite technology that's going to be available in the coming years, and it sort of sounds like it's sort of expected that is going to reveal that there is a lot more methane than we even know about now. Do you think that's going to be? Do you see this becoming an even bigger story than right now, or do you think with you've got these major leaders here right now making these pledges? Is this the methane moment that will maybe quiet back down for a little while, or do you think that this will only emerge as the leading issue on climate?
I think in terms of political signing up and this big COP and everyone talking about methane, it might be the big moment. But then there's going to be loads of stories about resistance, controversy, hypocrisy, not doing what they say. That kind of, I mean, as you get with any pledge, there's always problems in it. But so I think it will remain in the news.
And then in addition to oil and gas, you have the harder to regulate sectors like agriculture, waste, and I think that's only just, we're just only beginning to think about methane from those industries, and the solutions may not be as straightforward as for oil and gas. So this is a huge area. So if countries are committed to cracking down on methane, they're going to have to branch out to those sectors.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting kind of pathway for this, and just a good example of how methane it really touches all of these various aspects of our energy system, of our society, and of our government. You have agriculture, you have waste, you have oil and gas. Have you, and you primarily report on the oil and gas side of things. Are you looking into agriculture? Is that something that is sort of in a different beat within your organization?
It's on a different beat, but I don't sit close to her because we're not in the office. But I have a colleague who's on my team, and I've been sending her all the kind of various announcements about and kind of new voluntary commitments in agriculture. So there's a lot of space to cooperate. And again, I think there is a methane moment. People our editors know what methane is, and it's not just the butt of jokes. It's not just about the cows, and and so I think it's taken more seriously. And I think as a news outlet that has a lot of visual capabilities, this idea of uncovering the visible is very attractive for visual stories as well, and also this narrative of the folks who go out there with the cameras, the methane hunters. I mean, it's a great way to make that, I think, more accessible to readers. So there's a lot to do. Yeah, the moment is long.
The moment is long. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's an interesting point about the potential for methane, at least reporting on methane. You probably do end up teaming up with an agricultural reporter, an energy reporter, a legal reporter, a policy reporter. At a very, at a climate-focused organization like Climate Home News, how does that, how do you determine who's going to be on methane, who's going to be on oil and gas, agriculture, or is it, just sort of shared amongst all of you, depending on what you're interested in?
We're a very small team. There's about 3 of us, so we cover everything really. So kind of cover the most interesting bits of it. But yeah, it's a struggle.
That's great. And I guess I wonder if we could go back a little bit, Valerie. You'd mentioned that your editors all want methane stories now. Was it a hard sell to editors to begin with when you started looking into methane?
Yeah, I think probably. And again, sometimes just thinking about the photo editor, if you have a methane story, the photo they grab is of a cow. I wasn't talking about that. But no, I think I mean, obviously, it's the focus, the big focus on it by this administration. Now this global partnership definitely makes it more interesting as a global story. And yeah, I think again the technology that's available will allow us to I think to figure out more creative ways to do some good. I mean, you can do some good accountability reporting with this technology. I haven't done it yet. I really hope to be able to take this focus on methane and be able to do more reporting, because I think a story that I think is beginning to emerge more broadly is, again, this gap between the emissions that are reported and the actual emissions. So it's a big accountability area, I think.
Yeah, because for a lot of investigative journalism, you need loads of resources. You need a source. You need a load of money. For this, you just need a camera or a picture, and you just go look at this picture. Look what's going on. Why is it doing that? And then you kind of investigate their answers and if they're plausible. And yeah, it's a lot quicker.
Yeah. Is there a potential for data reporting within methane? Is that something that, do you find yourself crunching a large amount of data, or, filling out public records requests, or doing something like things like that that are, very much the purview of an investigative reporter?
Yeah, well, I think, go ahead.
It's a good idea.
No, I mean, I think that's definitely an area to focus on. And I think in the US, there's an enormous, and there's been reports on it by, I'm sure, Clean Air Task Force, EDF, looking at the marginal wells, of which there are so many. And I think there is some research being done, that I think some federal research on that problem. But I mean, that's a huge source of emissions that I think nobody really knows about, and again, could use some sunlight on it. So.
Yeah. Anything there to add? No. Okay. So I think another thing that I've, you are both. We know you. Our methane team know both of you, and I know that you likely do a lot of work to cultivate great sources. Not asking you to share too much of your practice here, but could you talk a little bit about that? What makes for a good source in these kinds of stories? What you're, who you're looking to hear from, and then even, who are you not hearing from that you might like to hear from?
Because we're kind of global and a small team, it's a bit outside of our capacity to build in-depth sources in a lot of countries. So I think Valerie would probably be better. So.
No, I mean, there are a lot of people out in the field who are very, I think that's one thing about methane, is the people who are out in the field and very, very plugged in on this topic are very passionate and make themselves available. They probably have access to a lot of information that you just don't. Again, it's not what's reflected in maybe state records. So in that sense, it's relatively easy to find good sources about methane, because the people who have been doing it have been doing it very passionately and have a kind of a deep focus on it. And I think on the regulatory side, I think we will begin to see this rulemaking process. I think we'll start during that process, at least in the U.S., as it develops its regulation, you'll see who the stakeholders are, because they're going to be commenting on the proposal, and I think you'll see a lot of interesting viewpoints. And industry as well. I think the challenging thing with industry is, again, they have their own numbers. They tell you what they're doing, and you've got to look at that, and some have been working on methane for a while, but then you have to kind of weigh that against against more data and other sources of data. But I think even some of those companies are willing to talk about methane, because some of them like to talk about it. Some of them buy ads on your Twitter feed. So
you get those too.
I think local people, who work in a place where methane is leaking, or live nearby. I mean, my experience down in England, we got the camera out, and there were some people out walking their dogs, and the guy's wife worked at the power plant, so he knew what everything did and what it was supposed to do and what shouldn't have been leaking from what. And there's a lot of knowledgeable people who can bring a bit of colour to stories, a bit from on the ground,
Yeah. And people living in those communities, when they find out that there is methane leaking near them or near their children's school or something like that, is there sort of an aha moment, or is it something that they've already known about?
Yeah, I think if you live near, it's usually in a big industrial facility, and you might have a bit of worries about that. But to see it, I think they definitely raise their eyebrows.
Yeah. Okay, well, just to pivot a little bit from strictly methane, I'm curious, how your experience has been at COP here so far, what it is you're kind of tracking, and we spoke a little bit before this about how you're both here till you're here for the long haul, till the bitter end. What are you following between now and Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, whenever we get done.
Say that. You've been here longer than I have.
Yeah, last week was the big announcements, all the leaders, the pledges. This week we're getting into the ministers come in and we're getting into the text and the clauses, and you can't really look at any of the. I'll be trying to look at Article 6 today, but you can't really look at it in isolation because they trade one thing off against each other, and a bad mood here is a bad mood there. So I'm following all the negotiations really.
Yeah.
I'm trying to.
Yeah, I'm looking at the same things, looking to see, whether we come out of Glasgow with a mechanism where there's more frequent updating of national climate plans to better reflect new data that might come out, because technology does improve so rapidly. So is there something built into the final outcome that kind of encourages countries to every year update their plans? Looking again, all the usual things, climate finance, and at some point, probably after the COP, looking at how this global methane pledge gets executed and how countries can actually tap into some of these resources that might now be available to them through the, that philanthropic announcement. How are countries going to use those resources to be able to tackle their biggest sources of methane? So that will be interesting.
Very interesting. And then before we take a couple of questions from the audience, I'm curious if you could let me know, if you have any advice for reporters who are kind of just getting started on the methane beat. Obviously, it's become such a big story here, and all eyes are on methane. There will likely be a lot more interest from media. What advice would you have for someone just getting started in digging into methane?
Well, I started quite recently, and the best thing is to get an expert to explain it all to you. Find a patient expert and get them to sit you down. No stupid questions, and try and get them to talk you through it.
Yeah, I think talking to some of those very passionate sources on methane, the people that are out, particularly the people who are out in the field and or have had experience maybe working in the industry and maybe have seen what actually happens and understand how methane not only leaks but is vented or. It's very useful to talk to people both in the field and with industry experience, I think.
Great. Okay, well, are there any questions from the audience? Oh, a couple. My colleague Alessia is going around with the mic.
Thank you very much. Very interesting session. I've got a couple of questions. First question, what kind of equipment do you have on board of your satellite to measure methane?
We don't have we don't have the equipment, so we have to rely. We don't. I've worked for Reuters. I don't think we have this equipment available to us. You have to rely on an agency or an organization that has some of the equipment.
You were talking about measuring methane, so I saw a picture of satellite. So I'd like to know. If it's possible, you could tell me what kind of equipment you have on board of this satellite. Maybe you know.
My organization does not have a satellite, but I'd be happy to connect you with organizations that do. Yeah. We have an optical gas imaging camera that we use, so we go around and take...
gas imaging camera. So it is optical camera or...
Yes.
Yeah? Really? Okay. And how many satellites are you going to launch on to the orbit in order to have this measurement and to have the data which could be used by different countries?
I don't think that we plan to launch any satellites anytime soon, but I can try to connect you afterwards with someone who might know.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Of course. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi there, I'm Karen Florini with Climate Central. And I'm going to make a request, not wearing my current hat, but rather my prior hat when I was the Deputy Climate Envoy for the State Department under the Obama administration. And the memo I most wanted to write to my successor, had I had one, which I didn't because you know why, was please stop using 25 as the global warming potential equivalent for methane.
Right.
In fact, I'm not even totally sure it's a great idea to use 86. I think we really need to, and I think one of the reasons that it's been a long time coming to have a methane moment is that we were misinforming our decision makers, both public policy and private, about the importance of the potency of methane when it is first released, which is over 100 times that of carbon dioxide. So I would just urge you and your colleagues in the media to please don't implicitly downplay methane by using the long-term potential, because methane's out of the atmosphere in about a dozen years, and talking about a 100-year time horizon just makes no sense. That was my urgent request. My question to you is what is most helpful to you in terms of story hooks, so that you can keep telling the methane story over and over again? Because we've got the public is just pretty clueless on methane and natural gas and what's natural about it anyway. So I'm wondering what your views on what makes for a good hook that those of us working in the NGO community can try to provide to you.
I would just say people are the hook. So people being either the ones who track the methane, who are out there in the field, or people in the communities directly affected, by methane that's either from large agriculture or oil and gas operations. I think I need to remind myself of this all the time. Just have people need to be front and center. If we can hook it to people, then you get everyone's attention.
More people than satellites.
Maybe the satellites would be cool too, but people are a little easier for us.
Thank you. I'm Samson from Nigeria. I was interested when the other guy was talking about glass flaring in Nigeria. It's a big issue in Nigeria, but the government is trying its best to curb it. But I just want to find out how your organization gets information about gas flaring in Nigeria. Are you having a correspondent there, or how do you get your information so that you can be well informed about the situation in the country? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. We don't have a correspondent in Nigeria. There's three or four of us in London. So to get that kind of information, we rely on sources, from an NGO or analysts. So yeah, people out in Nigeria. I mean, and the government as well. You can go to them for data. And it does seem like they're making a real effort over the last year or two to get to grips with it finally. But yeah, we have to rely on sources out there.
I think,
Hi, I'm Rachel. I'm a delegate from Israel. And my question to you is, we've heard Drew Shindell, whose work on GWP and the real impact of methane is really potent, I think relevant for the work and communication that you do. He also highlighted the fact that methane is the only greenhouse gas that not only has a climate impact in real time, but is also affecting human health.
Yes.
And I wanted to ask you about that type of storytelling that you're thinking to have around that, and especially around landfills, because that seems very relevant to me.
Yeah, I mean, I personally would like that to be a future area of focus. But yeah, as I was saying, and I think it was very clear in the IPCC report about not just the climate benefit, but the public health benefit. Again, that makes it more relatable to people, and having writing about the people directly affected is essential. Yeah,
there was a good video, well, not a good video, a terrible video of gas leaking from something or other right in front of a playground, and that was very striking as a story. I think it was in Romania.
Hi, I'm Observer from Russia, and I would like to know your opinion. What do you think about the fact that Russia didn't agree with the methane pledge? Like, what consequences it can have, and maybe what strategies can civil society choose to promote this agreement?
In terms of consequences, it depends if it might lead to them reducing methane less, and bad for climate change, obviously. In terms of strategies, I wouldn't really have a good answer on that. But you can obviously reduce methane without signing a pledge saying you're going to reduce methane, or maybe they'll reduce it. Maybe they'll sign it soon. We'll have to wait and see, but I'm not sure.
Well, I would be interested in what you as civil society, what's your kind of way to persuade the Russian government to join, and what's the selling point? I mean, personally, I think that would be interesting probably for our reporting as well.
Yeah, I would say also, as a member of civil society, it's a question we're very interested in also.
Hi, my name is Maria Scholl. I'm from the Stockholm International Water Institute, and I was wondering how much you've been looking into the connection between water pollution and methane.
I'm not really. I'd like to hear more about it, but I haven't done so.
I think you're all giving us some good story ideas for the future, so would love to talk about that.
Hi, I apologize. I missed the first part of the talk, so I don't know if you addressed this, but in the United States, there are probably 2.5, 3 million abandoned and orphaned methane spewing oil and gas wells, and I wonder what type of reporting you're doing on that and how you're following that.
Yeah, I mentioned it earlier, the marginal or abandoned wells. I mean, obviously, it's a huge problem. We don't know the full extent of the methane the methane footprint of those wells. Will be interesting because I think in the legislation coming out of the United States, it does address cleaning up some of those wells. So again, this is great. There's so many stories. This is another area where we both can learn about the full impact of those wells, and then efforts to remediate them, and because that is a part of the legislative package in the U.S.
I'd be happy to help you with that story. We run a foundation that is trying to plug those oil and gas wells. And
oh, great.
So happy to help you with that.
Fantastic.
Any other questions? Okay, I think we can wrap things up. Just so everyone knows, there will be a mini reception after this with food and drink. We're expecting just to hang out until it's all gone. So stay for a while, give all your story ideas to these two, and say hi. Thank you again to Valerie and to Joe, and a big round of applause for them, please.
Thanks.